I'm very pleased to invite our speakers today, both Ben Maness and Marc Weinstein, and they're going to be talking today about exam integrity investigations, and this is an introduction to the essentials. Just to give you a little bit of background about our speakers, Ben Maness is Managing Director of Caveon Investigative Services, and he serves as the Managing Operations Director, through which he provides consulting, investigation, and training services to sponsors of secure examinations. He's a noted subject matter expert in exam integrity, investigation security, and public safety, having held roles in federal and municipal law enforcement, homeland security, as a security executive in nonprofit and private organizations nationwide. Ben is also the Director of Test Security with the nation's largest medical specialty certification board, and he's responsible there for overseeing test security and investigative initiatives for roughly 250,000 certified physician specialists and candidates worldwide. Now, since joining ABIM, Ben has worked with the board to address fraud, theft, and cheating in the board certification process by creating new best practices in the protection of intellectual property and exam integrity, and resulting in over 150 cases for administrative sanction, civil complaint, or referral to law enforcement agencies. Ben also works with the American Board of Medical Specialties, the Association of Test Publishers, and he's an elected governor for the Philadelphia chapter of the InfraGard. So welcome, Ben. And also Marc Weinstein. Marc is also the Managing Director of Caveon Investigative Services, and he provides consulting, investigative, and training services to sponsors of secure examinations. He's an experienced professional investigator and a trial attorney who began his career in 1998 as a prosecutor in the Office of the State Attorney for Miami-Dade County, Florida, where he investigated and prosecuted thousands of criminal cases for the state of Florida. And since leaving the Office of the State Attorney, Marc has been in private practice where he represents and counsels companies, organizations, and individuals in white-collar crime matters and complex civil business disputes through the country, with a special emphasis on cases involving fraud. Over the course of his legal career, Marc has tried 45 cases before juries in state and federal courts throughout the United States and deposed more than 1,000 witnesses. And a significant part of Marc's law practice includes representing sponsors, publishers of secure high-stakes examinations to assist them in implementing legal protections to minimize cheating, strengthen the integrity of test results, and enforce all intellectual property rights that may apply to their examinations. Marc has drafted and revised examining agreements as well as test sponsor policies and procedures, and he has successfully represented test sponsors in lawsuits against numerous perpetrators of exam fraud. So welcome, Marc, and welcome, Ben, and let me turn the time now over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you very much, Jamie. I'm Ben Maness, and I hope you could differentiate the accents and the voice tones between Marc and myself as we go along, because we will be going back and forth between slides. And let's face it, here's why we're here. Testing is no longer what it used to be when it was pencil and paper only and when the stakes were a little lower. Right now, regardless of what sector you're in, how you offer tests, whether it's government, nonprofit, or where you are, the stakes of testing has raised, and the unique and very differentiated ways that people are cheating and defrauding the testing process have become more and more complicated over the years. So it doesn't matter whether you're, a nuclear missile operator for the U.S. Air Force, an FBI agent, a conductor on Metro North, a board-certified physician, or a teacher. Cheating is an issue. And what we're seeing now, whether you're in the United States or another country, is a revolution in how testing enforcement is looked at. While things like finances and budgets are tied to testing as a performance measure, it's important that everyone is capable of investigating possible fraud. And what we're seeing now is akin to the way TSA was created after 9/11. If you are not investigating possible test fraud, if you're not creating test security programs that include the investigation to assure the validity of your exams, it's a time to start looking at that now. Next slide, please. Want to get the poll?
Yep. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. I'll go ahead and launch the poll. You should be able to see the poll on your screen now. So have you responded to an incident that threatened the integrity or validity of a test result? So go ahead and vote, please. I'll give you just a couple minutes to vote. Okay. Most people have voted. Another 10 seconds or so. Okay, looks like the voting has slowed down. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share the results. And Jamie, I don't think you can see that. So yeah, go ahead, Ben. You can comment on those results.
So 76% say you have, and that's a very good number. The question is how you did so and what the outcome was, and if that process could be improved in a way that A, is more efficient, but B, more effective. So we're going to get into the granularity of how that process could be improved as we go along. Next slide, please.
Give me a second. Ben, I'm going to change the setting on my screen so that I can see everything, and I'll get it back up. There we go. There we go.
Okay. So I come from high-stakes certification. With medical specialty certification, we got into the test security business in 2008, and we were the first medical specialty board in this side of the world that was doing any type of test security. And what we discovered was it's universal. If you're in certification, obviously test security issues will give you a loss of revenue or intellectual property that could be crippling to your business. Erosion of your credentials, brand, or public trust is a major issue. If people think that that credential is easily cheated on, it really, really makes it hard for people to take your credentials seriously, and it questions the survival of your credential, period. And the worst, of course, is the possibility of unqualified or lesser qualified people practicing on your name, on your credential. Think about the American Board of Radiology. When their cheating scandal came out on CNN, it was a surprise due to an outside whistleblower. There's nothing worse than being caught on national news answering questions you're not prepared to answer. So this is one of the things we want to prevent. If you're at the state education department or a school district, you're no stranger to this with things like Atlanta, Philadelphia, D.C., even in smaller communities like Clarksdale, Mississippi. You're finding situations right now where the state education departments and the school districts are using standardized testing as a quality metric tied to school district funding. Obviously, both want fair assistance to students who need targeted improvement. But if those students are fraudulently being reported as proficient and advanced, how do you get them the help they need? We've seen kids without reading comprehension going into middle school, so it's incredibly high stakes to make sure that these are investigated properly. And it's just as high on the school district as it is on the state education department. Why? Because state education departments often task these investigations down to school districts, and if that investigation is not handled properly, the scope may change and to looking at the school district as opposed to just looking at the school or classroom in question. Obviously, if you're in another governmental agency, you give civil service exams, professional exams, and certification exams. All of these things have had evidence of compromise in recent years. And lastly, there are some inspectors general on this call, and we're glad to have you because as these scandals are arising, we're seeing more and more inspectors general tasked to investigate these things. What we're also seeing is not a lot of inspector generals having training specific to exam integrity cases. Why? Well, they traditionally didn't have these duties. And as they oversee educational bodies or professional testing programs, it's important that they're able to handle this, because if they're called upon, as we've seen in things like Philadelphia's cheating scandal and in other states, we want them to be able to work jointly with their stakeholder agencies to perform not only an investigation, but ongoing performance audits with minimal manpower. We just had a call recently with a major inspector general agency in a big U.S. county that oversees the school as well as the other municipal entities. And they said, gee, testing, that's another headache that we're not prepared for. Let me give you a fable. In Philadelphia, the testing scandal arose immediately after a $7 million contract fraud case was in the media. The cheating scandal still garners front page news to this day, while barely anyone is remembering the $7 million contract fraud. So for the Inspector Generals on the call, it's important to be in tune with this trend because it's garnering major attention nationwide. Next slide, please. Mark? So you're going to ask yourself, do you have an investigative response plan? Obviously, you know, test security plans are coming up with assessing the risk and vulnerability presented by a specific exam integrity issue. The question is, are you, on this call, prepared to do a complete, comprehensive investigation into these things? That requires a framework. Are you responding to these things, ready to handle them? And having that comprehensive investigative plan, whether it's your trained manpower or a stakeholder agency or even an outside vendor. So having exam integrity specific training or having it built into your SOP is extremely important. Next slide, please.
Okay, looks like it's time for another poll, so I'll go ahead and launch that poll. And the poll is open, so go ahead and vote. Do you have an investigative response plan to respond to security incidents? About 60% of the people have voted. We'll give you another 10 seconds or so. Okay, last few seconds, get those votes in there. We've got about 85%. Okay, looks good. I'll go ahead and close that poll and share the results. Any thoughts on this, guys?
Well, I'm pleased to see that 65% of the participants on this call, have at least thought about putting together an investigative response plan and have something in place. And for those that already have a plan, we hope that you'll, get some additional ideas about how you may be able to improve your plan. And for those of you who are either unsure or don't have a plan, we hope to give you some good ideas to get started. And if we could go to the next slide, I'll be glad to move forward. So, Ben has already touched on this briefly, and what I'm going to do now is just sort of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about for probably the next 10 minutes. And the idea here is to take a holistic approach to test security and put in place a test security framework or program that is the result of having conducted a thorough threat assessment that identifies the people on your staff or outside of your company, if you outsource these matters, who will handle test security issues, that you have comprehensive policies and procedures in place to deal with all aspects of test integrity and security, and that would include agreements with vendors, agreements with examinees, and agreements with your own employees, and that you have executive leadership and legal support that really takes responsibility and owns these issues. We're also going to talk about what types of detection methods that you would use. Once you have the framework in place, we're going to talk about the different methods you can use to detect security incidents. And then we're going to get to, what we have in our experience seen is usually where organizations sort of stop short. And it's great that the vast majority of the people on this call have an investigative response plan, but I can tell you that many of the test sponsors that we've worked with, while they may have a very high-level plan, they haven't considered all the contingencies of an investigation, and many simply just don't have a plan. So we're going to talk about the types of components and issues that you should be considering when your organization puts its investigative response plan together. Next slide, please. So when you think about the framework, you have to consider first, do you have the resources within your organization to do this, or is this something you're going to have to outsource? I mean, some test sponsors have very small staffs, almost a skeleton crew, right? But it's still a very, very high-stakes exam that they're sponsoring. So they may need to think about outsourcing. Others have large organizations behind them, but may not have identified the people to give the responsibilities to. So that's a process that you need to think through. And you also have to really ensure that your executive leadership understands the importance of these issues and how it goes to the core of your business. Because if you don't have buy-in from your leadership and they don't have realistic expectations and an understanding of what needs to be done to ensure the integrity of your exam, you're not going to get very far. Next slide, please.
Wait, before you go to the next slide, remember something about corporate buy-in and realistic expectations. Most problems with corporate buy-in that we've seen, and executive level buy-in that we've seen, have been based in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of doing something that they have not been trained to do. Remember in informing them to come from a very educated and informed place, and make sure their realistic expectations are there. And the reason why is because we've seen things like state education departments telling their staff, we'll never actually interview any children. You can't do that if you want the case to be closed. People saying, we don't want to do this with an interview, or we don't want to accuse anyone of anything. If you're putting these road bumps in front of you before you've actually been able to see what happened, you're setting up your investigations for failure and creating a vicious cycle. So make sure all your outreach to get C-suite buy-in is based in reality and is done with an educated approval, a report, so that it isn't just, well, is it going to be like a Law and Order TV show? Next slide. Is this me or you, Mark?
You.
So,
I think.
Go ahead.
It's you.
All right. I'll take it. So, planning to investigate. You need a test security framework, and it starts before you even take your first investigative assignment. One of the biggest things we've seen it's a problem is when people think they've alerted an allegation or a problem and then just go out and investigate when they don't have the framework in place. And what happens is they either don't have the needs or the resources that they could accomplish their mission, or even worse, they accomplish their mission and they don't know what to do once they have because the policies aren't there. So you need that threat assessment. You need to know where you are, and it has to be done with a red cell, blue cell approach. That's your worst case scenario versus your best case scenario. If you're only assessing your day-to-day operations and not looking at it from a catastrophic business continuity standpoint, then you can't expect to handle what may happen in the field. Life performance auditing of exam administrations is important. Development activities. Are you auditing your program from the inception, from the registration of the first candidate and the development of your first test question on down to your test administration and scoring process? And a full review of your organizational procedures and policies relating to testing to include your staff agreements, stakeholder agreements, and candidate agreements. Why? Because if they're not effective, you can't enforce them. Your staff designee. Whoever you have doing this, whether it's someone who has other tasks or someone hired for the mission or even a vendor or outside stakeholder, if they're investigating exam integrity issues, who are they? They have to be in your plan. It can't be someone you assign ad hoc. does that designee conduct other preventative exam integrity functions like your test security program, right? Does he do your web patrolling or web intelligence, stakeholder outreach, threat assessment? What training or experience does that person have in exam integrity investigations? In my case, it was my law enforcement background, and I had to learn testing. But if you're from an IT or a testing background, how do you learn investigations? It's very important. Effective policies and agreements are essential. Candidate, staff, and vendor agreements have to be bulletproof. Employment and candidate policies that require cooperation with investigations is essential. Otherwise, you could travel somewhere to talk to a candidate, and they could tell you, I don't want to talk to you, and you just shrug and roll your eyes, because if you don't have a policy there, you have no way to enforce it. You have to have your MOAs with outside investigative bodies. This is important for the inspector generals on the call or any state education department people who task other agencies like a school district or a law enforcement agency to conduct their investigations, because if you don't have a specific MOA, how do you know, how could you vouch for the quality investigation and make sure that it's done correctly? And in agreements with subjects who provide assistance. These are cooperation agreements, and they're very important if you're looking at an organized test cheating ring. Next slide, please.
It's me?
Yes.
Okay, so we've already talked about having leadership buy-in, and part of having leadership buy-in, as Ben has already referenced, is you have to take a vertically integrated approach. You have many different components of a testing organization, from test development to registration to administration to psychometrics, and it's important that everyone understands what their role is in your organization when a test security incident occurs. So you need to have an escalation path in place, and everyone needs to know exactly what their position is on that escalation path. You also should probably work out a decision tree so that if there is some type of internal disagreement over how to handle a particular incident, you don't spend as much time figuring out how you're going to resolve the dispute as you should be spending figuring out how to respond to the incident. You certainly need to think about what it costs to respond to these incidents, both from an internal perspective, when you have employee time and other internal resources that you're dedicating to these matters, and an external perspective if you have vendors or outside professionals assisting you with the matter. Certainly if you're dealing with vendors or outside professionals, you should always be asking for an estimate. And we talked about organizational priorities, and frankly, those priorities are something that really need to be figured out well in advance of an incident occurring. And then finally, we talk about effective legal support. You certainly want a lawyer who understands your business. But again, if you're dealing with a relatively large testing organization, there are many components to a business that may cross many different areas of law. You have employment law, you have corporate transactions, you have intellectual property, you have white-collar internal investigations. And the reality is that you need to have at least one lawyer who understands every aspect of your business. Now, that lawyer may not be an expert in every area of law, but they have to at least be able to understand it. And when it comes to conducting investigations, the reality is you need a lawyer who understands white-collar internal investigations and criminal law, because those are areas that come into play, and certainly intellectual property law as well. But if you're conducting an investigation and you don't know what you're going to find, and you don't know what the end result is going to be of the investigation, you need a lawyer who's prepared to consider all those possible outcomes and to gather and direct your gathering of evidence in a way that enables you to do whatever's in the organization's best interest. That could mean sanctions from your internal processes. That could mean regulatory action if you're a licensure agency. That could mean civil action if you're taking action against, for example, a test prep company that stole your exam content. Or it could mean a criminal referral. And there's other nuances in between all of those examples. So you really need someone who understands all of these issues. And look, the last question is not one that any organization can afford not to ask. what's it going to cost? And the reality is that all fees are negotiable. And so if you're happy with your legal services, but you feel like you're paying too much, that's something you should be talking to your legal counsel about. And if you're not happy, well, you should know there's lots of lawyers out there, and you should be looking for lawyers that you can afford who will give you the expertise that you need to really deal well with these issues. Next slide, please.
So we're moving away from the planning phase and we're moving into the actual detection method. And it's important to look at this from the right standpoint. Before, traditionally in testing, we looked at everything from the process of can we or can we not invalidate an exam, which is a very low comparatively proof of burden than, let's say, a criminal, beyond a reasonable doubt issue. The problem I'm trying to communicate is when you detect something, you do not know where it will eventually lead you. This is the very, very first point where you see it. So whether it's through your sources or tip lines, someone calling you to tell you that, or sending you an anonymous email, or sending you a letter, whether it's through online or social intelligence, which through the web is becoming one of the biggest myriad of intelligence you could get on this stuff. The age of social media is ridiculous because people will actually post their bad behavior. So the question I'm asking you is, are you out there looking for it? Because there's a treasure trove out there. Data forensics and psychometric auditing. This is not just a detection method, but also an investigative tool. So it's very important to have a data forensic program built into your psychometrics so that this huge chunk of information is used, whether it be examining statistics, erasure analysis, which is a lot of the big school district cases are gleaned, other methods, looking at books, looking at times taken, looking at time zone cheating, looking at CBT response, looking at possible collusions and agreement patterns. This is a huge piece of evidence that you need when detecting this so that if you go to a full field investigation, you're properly prepared to ask the right questions. Surveys. Whether it's through a pretext call or an actual survey to all your candidates, if you're putting the right questions in a survey, you'd be surprised how many answers come back that will help you identify possible cheating incidents or trends of collusion that may be out there. One of the biggest cases Mark and I ever worked with started with a pretext survey asking candidates who through data forensics were suspicious how they prepared for the exam. And guess what? We found our main investigative target through that process. Performance auditing and spot checking are essential. If you're not going out and checking on how people are actually taking your exams and how your stakeholders are administering exams, then you're completely reliant on their reports to know something's wrong. If they're not doing their job 100% to your specifications, or worse, they're colluding with the candidates, then guess what? You won't know about it if you're not out there. So get out in that population and see them, whether it's through a secret shopper program or an actual site visit. And then lastly, interviews. They are perfectly fine to do, within everyone's right as an organization to do, and probably the most efficient way to know what's going on. So get out there and talk to people. Remember, if you're interviewing people based on an actual allegation you have and not just through an audit process, those interviews should always be conducted by people who are trained investigators, simply because you need to know when people are lying to you and how they may be lying to you. Next slide, please.
Well, can I just make one more point before we go on to the question? The next question is it's a poll. You mentioned earlier about how some organizations, Ben, are resistant to the suggestion of conducting interviews. And, sometimes people in the organization at the decision-making level, I think, have misconceptions about how interviews are conducted. And, for example, you used the expression earlier, I think, about making an accusation. But you have to recognize, we could conduct, Ben and I together, could conduct a week-long seminar on interview techniques, okay? And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this right now in terms of the details of best practices in conducting interviews. But I can tell you that we don't walk into a room with the person that we're about to interview and start making accusations. And interviews, you know, if we did, our interviews wouldn't be very successful. And together, Ben and I have conducted hundreds of interviews of examinees in high-stakes testing across many different sectors of testing, including assessment, certification, licensure, and professional degree admission programs, okay? And I can tell you that interviews can be incredibly helpful to figuring out what happened. And while people certainly do lie, many don't. So if someone within your organization is resistant to the idea of interviews just because they have preconceived notions about them, you know, we would like to help you help to educate the people within your organization about how professional interviews are conducted to try and, you know, essentially dissuade people of the view that interviews are somehow oppressive or abusive or in any way threatening to examinees or somehow put your organization at risk. That's simply not the case. So now if we could move on to the next slide. I just want to make sure we...
Marc and Ben, this is Marc and Ben. So we have a couple questions. The first one, before we get to the poll, is MOA, what does that stand for? It was Memorandum of...
Agreement.
Thank you.
Okay. It could also be an MOU, which is a Memorandum of Understanding. It's the same idea. It's basically an agreement between agencies as to how to handle certain duties, including, in this case, we're talking about investigative duties.
Okay. Second question is, and this relates back to doing performance auditing. So if you have students taking exams in a foreign country, it may not be practical to perform spot checks. Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, I do that all the time, actually, and there were other people on this call who had that responsibility. So there's two ways to approach it. One, internally, you could create and budget a site visit program where you're either sending secret shoppers, which they do have contract secret shoppers as well, or you could go out and check these places yourself. If it's too far and within the budget, then you could hire local investigators to do it for you. But that's when it gets very tricky. Think about it as a risk-based, and this is part of your threat assessment to step back a little bit. If you're testing in far-flung areas, especially those if you're not doing a country assessment on them to see if, A, they agree with the Berne Agreement and they have a good enforcement history, so if your property is lost there, they will enforce it, and if it's practicable to do so, then you should budget having the test security, inspection, and enforcement for that country. Otherwise, you're putting your organization at great risk. So these two things go hand in hand. When you make the decision to operate outside your borders, you should have the method to audit and investigate there too.
And I would also just point out that some test sponsors, you know, have tested the waters in far countries, you know, far-flung countries around the world, and have had, you know, very bad experiences, have not wanted to put the resources into protecting their exams in those locations, and have made the decision to pull out of those places because there's a cost to offering those exams throughout the world, and you have to be prepared to, you know, to pay that cost. And it's really a business. At the end of the day, it's a business analysis, but part of the analysis has to be what's it going to cost me to protect the integrity of my exam in these locations, and that means being on the ground.
Which means everyone on this call should go back to their organizations if they haven't already, and I'm running about 50% of the organizations I know do this, and have a to-the-penny account of how much each test question is costing you, including not just your test development fees, but your psychometrics and administration and copywriting fees. It's important to know that because if you ever suffer a loss, you know how much you lost. Next slide, please. And if there's other questions, we'll be happy to take them at the end. poll.
Okay,
What's
I'll
the
go
poll?
ahead and launch that poll. In conducting an investigation of a security incident, has your organization conducted interviews? So go ahead and vote.
Do this one pretty quick.
Okay, about 80% of the people have voted. I'll give you 5 more seconds. Okay, I will go ahead and share those results.
So it's getting a little less each time, right? Making the split even. This seems to be something, I guess, because of the saturation of television that people have a preconceived notion of, and it is extremely important to do this. I have had psychometricians in my organization spend months debating statistics that I've answered in literally 5 minutes to a half an hour in front of someone out there in the field. So think about it like that. Next question. Slide, sorry. What happened?
Okay. There we go.
Jamie, I'm seeing the Caveon cover slide here. I'm not seeing the show.
Let me see what's going on here.
Well, I'm going to start going if that's okay.
Please do, Marc.
Whenever we get it,
I'll
get it.
I'll catch up with you.
So now, we've talked about the importance of setting up a holistic test security framework, and we talked about methods of detecting cheating. And I should say, it's not just cheating. We're talking about detecting, anything that could make the results of your exam invalid. Okay, and now once you've detected an incident, you want to know, well, what do we do? It's a simple 4-step process. Okay, the first process is you have to identify what your investigative goals are. All right, in reaction to the incident and the information you have at the outset. What are your investigative goals? Then you need to determine and identify the evidence that is available to you to investigate the matter. The third step is you're going to preserve, gather, and document that evidence. And the fourth step is you're going to report the findings of your investigation and make recommendations. So you say then, well, what could my investigative goals be? Number one is very simple, and anyone who's in this business knows what the number one goal has to be if you're in the testing business. It's validity. So the number one goal of your investigation is to ensure that the exam result at issue or results are valid. That's number one. Number two, you want to identify anyone who has violated your testing rules and sought an unearned advantage on the exam, or sought to help someone else get an unearned advantage on the exam. Number three, you want to preserve the integrity, the meaning, and the value of your credential, okay? Whether it's certification, whether it's a license, whether it's admission to higher education, you have to be protecting, and in the for-profit business world, you'd talk about protecting your brand, okay? That's shorthand for the same thing. You're protecting the value of what it is that you do as a testing organization. Number four, and this is important for test sponsors that use public money especially, it's about restoring or building public confidence, okay? Everyone pays a lot of money in taxes in their local school districts, and, it's really important that when they're administering these state tests, that they're doing it in a way that the public can have confidence that their tax dollars are being spent to educate kids, and kids are being assessed to see what they've learned, and schools are being assessed based on these outcomes in a way that is authentic and true. And last but not least, you want to deter cheating. So those are the investigative goals that we think of. Your organization may have some more specific goals, but that's what they are in broad terms. Next slide, please.
Next slide. Hit your space bar. There you go.
Okay. So next, what you want to do, again, you're responding to an incident. That's where we are in this process right now. And you want to have an investigations plan. All right? You're going to want to establish your goals, create a timeline, identify who's working the investigation, identify and prioritize the collection of evidence, identify the witnesses to be interviewed and in what order, and then determine how you're going to report the findings. Now, it's important to understand that you may have to do your investigation in stages, okay? It may be of a fast-moving situation that's very time-sensitive, and you have to do either a triage or a preliminary investigation to sort of see what's there and determine how much deeper you want to go. And Ben's going to talk about right now what you need to do when you're in that situation. But the reality is, even if you do a preliminary investigation or a triage, if what you find is fire where you saw smoke, you're going to have to do a larger scale investigation, and this planning process would apply equally to either the triage or to the longer term investigation. Ben, you want to talk about triage? Next slide,
Absolutely.
please.
Next slide, please. So as we are not law enforcement for the most part on this call, remember that a preliminary investigation or incident triage, depending on how you want to classify it, is essential in getting your facts, your substantiated allegations, or for what you may think is happening out there, and presenting them intelligently to senior staff if you are to either close something out or request a further investigation. So after you detect something, what happens next? How could you decide what type of investigation is warranted, whether it be something you could do in office, sending an inquiry out by mail, or doing a full field investigation? Can you do when your prelim investigation? It's important to do, and you've heard this all before, the who, what, when, where, and how. A lot of you are saying you forgot why. No, I didn't. Why is something that in the testing world people get hung up on. I've had staff credentialing committees, sanctions committees come back to me and say, well, he didn't really mean to cheat. They just, didn't know. Doesn't matter. 90% of testing violations are general intent in nature. So why is something that gets organizations hung up? And the bad result there is it creates an unfair sanctions process if one person's sanctioned one way and the other sanctioned another way because we're worried about intent. Testing, mostly general intent. Also, are the allegations substantiated enough to invest into your resources? These things are not cheap. If you're putting people in the field or you're ordering data forensic analysis, you need to know that the allegations are severe enough and that they're corroborated enough to warrant all that investment, whether it be even time as opposed to money. Are you preserving your initial evidence? From the second you detect something and you start your prelim investigation or your incident triage, you need to start preserving your evidence. So if it's something you found online, get a screen cap, go into the Wayback Machine and look at who is. If they take that site down tomorrow because they know you're onto them, do you have what you need to preserve that and go forward? Same thing goes with recorded phone calls of tip line allegations or statements that people give you. If that person you talk to changes their story because they're worried about whatever social pressures they might have you preserve their statement in a way that you could bring it to the proper authorities? So it's important to start doing that. And then, of course, reporting the results of your prelim investigation up the chain of command to your executive staff, making recommendations to the leadership, and making them in a very impartial, stepwise, and detailed approach so that they can't say, oh, we're going to go play cowboy or you're looking to be a detective. This is about validity, so we want to make it valid. Next slide, please. Mark?
Yeah. So, again, in planning your investigation, you need to know what your goals are. And it's your goals that are really going to dictate, your goals and the nature of the incident are going to dictate what the scope of your investigation is. But you need to know what the scope of your investigation is. Are you looking at every, all 10,000 people who took the exam in the last administration? Or are you looking at the 25 aberrant, test takers? You need to know. You also need to consider whether a performance audit may be more suitable than an investigation. And that's going to be a very fact-sensitive inquiry. You know, if it doesn't seem like there was a problem that originated with the examinee, him or herself, but there was a process problem that led to it, for example, with your test administration vendor, then a performance audit may make more sense and be more cost-effective than a full-scale investigation. The next question, you know, we left in as a rhetorical question. Okay, how important is confidentiality? It's critical. The only people who should know everything that's going on in the investigation are the people who are directly involved in the investigation. Okay, investigations must be maintained. The confidentiality of the investigations must be maintained, or they can be compromised. Next slide, please. Ben has alluded to certain types of evidence that you are going to want to make sure you preserve and collect early on in your triage, and preserving evidence is critical. Test publishers often only hold on to paper test booklets and answer sheets for a specified period of time. Test administration vendors sometimes only hold on to videos if they hold videos for 30 days. Some are 90 days. You have to know how long this evidence is going to be available, and in any event, it is always, you always need to move quickly to preserve all the evidence that you may need to look at in your investigation. And that would include documents. And you need to be communicating to potential witnesses that they shouldn't be destroying any documents that they have related to the investigation, and they shouldn't be talking about the investigation to anyone. And next slide, please. Whenever you're collecting evidence in an investigation, and I'm sure if there are inspectors general on the phone, they're very familiar with this, or any lawyers would be very familiar with the concept of chain of custody. And chain of custody, it is essential that you always maintain the chain of custody, because that ensures that the evidence that is submitted to decision makers, whether it be a sanctions board, an appeals board, or a court, at the end of the day, decision makers need to know that the evidence that they have has not been tampered with, tainted, and is authentic in every way. So this is a very simple set of rules, 6 rules to follow to preserve the chain of custody. I think this will be made available when we finish our webinar today, so I'm not going to just read out loud all of the steps on the chain of custody guidelines, but it's a fairly simple process that ensures that all the evidence that you're collecting is in fact authentic and has not been tampered with. Next slide, please. Ben?
So, okay, let's look at some of the evidence you could gather. First things first, data forensics and analytics. And why is that number 1? Simply because if you're scoring your exams and you're doing your own internal psychometric analysis, this data is already at your fingertips. It's important to use it effectively so you know if any aberrant behavior within the examination occurs. Also, any documentation that may exist of testing procedures and participants, including any seating charts, chain of custody documents, and test and answer documents. Why is that important? Because, you know, a lot of times, like in a school district investigation, they'll have the rules and they'll abide, quote unquote, by the rules, but fail to do it in an effective way so that the evidence is coming in routinely. So if you have an allegation down the road, you could start there and see if all the P's and Q's were dotted or adhered to. Video and/or audio surveillance. Marc already talked about it, but this stuff expires. If you get CCTV footage, 30 days is the clock. So make sure you're getting your requests in 30 days. And the same thing goes with any biometric data that you may have or log files. Log files are basically keystroke files. So any CBT, computer-based testing administrators out here, that tells you if people were going back, looking at things, marking things for review, they went to the bathroom, they came back, they changed their answers. That's all right there in the log file for you. So you don't have to break the world to get to that stuff. It's already there at your fingertips. Another important thing to look at is test center admittance and break logs. How are they using their breaks and why? Are they going on breaks together? it's important to log that stuff in and out. Any tips or statements obviously need to be signed and held. Electronic evidence, including to cell phone images, text messages, call records, emails. No, you don't need to subpoena all this stuff. In our letters of inquiry, when we have an exam day incident where we think someone unlawfully accessed a phone, guess what? We request these documents, and since they're bound by their own agreement to cooperate with these investigations, they'll get us the bills to see if they were texting each other on their breaks. And then, of course, like I said before, social media and anything these folks post online. People go and talk to each other all the time, or in certain circumstances like collusion, you'd be surprised what connections you could make, whether it be across the country or across the world, through social media. If they're connected together and you suspect collusion, that's a good place to start. Next, go ahead.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide. For some reason, the last bullet point on conducting on investigations and gathering evidence didn't make it onto the slide, but it was interviews. And interviews, and it was purposely last, but interviews usually should be, and there are exceptions to this rule, but usually should be the last step in your process, because when you go into the interview room to talk to whomever you're interviewing, you want to make sure that you have the documents to show them. You have the test booklets. You have the video. You have the keystroke logs. You want to be able to test their truthfulness. And if they are lying to you, you want to be able to confront them with evidence that makes that clear. So interviews are critical and cannot be overlooked, the importance of interviews, and that would usually be your last step. So
reporting.
Right, reporting. So you've completed your investigation, and now the question is, how are you going to report? Now, you can report by simply giving a presentation to the decision makers in your organization, or you can write a report. Most organizations prefer a report, but you have to keep in mind, if there's a possibility of public disclosure or even disclosure to a third party or the media, that report may get out. And so you have to be very comfortable with everything you're putting in that report, and as well you should be. I mean, you certainly shouldn't be putting anything in writing that you don't have 100% confidence in. But there are times when it may be more appropriate, because of the potential for third-party action, not to write a report. Okay? The next slide, please. If you do decide you're going to write a report, you need to think about what level of detail you're going to include in the report, okay? Because you can write a report at a very high level to summarize the evidence, or you can get down to the very granular level and give very detailed evidence. But there are some basic components of any report, whether it's going to be at a high level or at a detailed level, that you're going to want to make sure you include, and we've set those basic components out on this slide. They include an introduction, a description of the triggering events that led to the investigation, a description of your investigative methodology, a concise statement, okay, of the specific findings of the investigation. And that's really important, because people just want to cut to the chase, all right? And that's something you should be able to do, you know, without excessive language. You just get to the point, say what your findings are. And then you say, you give a summary of the evidence at whatever level of detail you've decided to stick with. And you certainly then want to identify any person who engaged in wrongdoing and violated your rules or policies and any other laws regulations that they would have violated, and then say what the organization should do about it. Those are the basic components of any report. Next slide, please. It's important that you're not using a lot of adjectives or adverbs in your, your report. Your report should be factual, and if you're going to have detailed evidence that includes documents or screen prints or anything of that nature, that's usually best included in an addendum. And, you know, again, it depends on the nature of the organization, but if you're going to be making recommendations about lessons learned, you may want to consider putting those in a separate document that could be kept confidential. Next slide, please.
Hey, Mark and Ben, we're going to need to start to wrap this up, and I think we're getting to the end here.
We're on the
so
last
just
slide.
let you guys know. Great.
Oh, okay, we're getting there. And folks, we'll stay on the phone if you have questions, so don't worry. All right, so remember there's 2 reports. Another one identifies changes that you could make to your test security plans if you do have best practice or lessons learned identifications during your investigation. Remember, these are fluid documents. So was the vulnerability identified through the incident? What can be done to change your policies? And what are other ramifications to the organization so that you could best hone your policies? We're building the better mousetrap. So make sure you're staying current. Next slide. That's basically the same thing. We'll keep going. So if you're coming to ATP, and Lord knows with this weather, I'm looking forward to getting to California. We're giving the sessions all 3 days in a row. So March 2nd at 4th, Security in the Forefront. Exam Security Incident Workshop, that's March 3rd, 8:30 in the morning, waking you up. And working a case. Best practices in conducting exam integrity investigations. It will be different from this one. March 4th, 11:30 a.m. And join us on Twitter at Exam Integrity or on our 2 LinkedIn groups, Exam Integrity of the ATP Test Security group, where we post all the best practices as they arise. When we find a big cheating scandal, we'll throw that out there and talk about it so that we can get a good discussion and learn from each other. Last slide. Well, we'll get to questions. Give them the emails. They don't need to see the kid.
So I want to thank Ben and Mark today for the presentation. We got comments from folks saying, boy, these guys really know what they're talking about. And, I mean, you guys have a ton of experience, so it's a pleasure to have you speak to the group today. I will ask if anyone, we will stay on for about 5 more minutes to answer any questions. So let me get some of those questions up. One question is, any advice for interviewing K-12 students when investigating possible educator misconduct?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's something we do very well, and it's something that, you know, first off, it's not as bad as everyone makes it out to be. If you establish a rapport with these children, these youths, and of course, it also depends on the grades. If you're getting into a upper middle schooler or high schooler, it becomes a little more of an issue due to social acculturation. You know, cooperation with investigations becomes an issue. But with the younger, it's about establishing rapport. One thing I will say, make sure you record your interviews. And if you're very overt about it and you're not hiding the recorder, there's no consent issues there. You tell them you're recording it. But if that statement changes, and sometimes it does when they get home and their parents, you know, who may not want to cooperate, scold them for it, you have them on the record. So it's incredibly important to do so. But it's also important to set them at ease the minute they come in the room, and make sure you tell them, if you're looking at an educator misconduct situation, that they're not in trouble in any way, shape, or form. And you'll be surprised how honest they are.
Okay, great. So let me we got another question. A few slides ago, Ben, you mentioned using data forensics to detect an incident, and quickly mentioned that those results can, you know, inform your interviews. So could you maybe expand on that, how data forensics helps you understand who to talk to and the types of questions to ask?
Mark, you want to handle that, or? You know, we both work situations where, all right, first, we've had 2 sets of data forensics. The first one gives you the flag with the unusual agreement patterns, aberrants that could only be described as someone capable or a group of people capably winning the lottery twice in a row, because those percentiles are so low. So what we do is we take that and we consider it a machine that we feed back information in. So when we start our prelim investigation, and we could narrow down groups in classrooms or different geographic locations or times or dates, we start feeding that back into the data forensics. And then what the scientists will start crunching those numbers. They'll give you a specific group. Let's say you're looking at wrong to right erasures. In those wrong to right erasures, you want the most egregious percentages, and that will help you select, say in this case, the students you want to talk to. As opposed to looking at 5 classrooms worth of kids, you'll be in there all week. You're looking at 5 to 20 really good kids. You pull their exam books or any other evidence that you may have. You bring it into the interview, and you'll surprise about the cooperation you could get.
Well, you know, you also want to, you sometimes need to establish controls, right? So you may have someone with high wrong to right erasures, right, while they're in a suspect school or a suspect classroom. Well, you're going to want to look at that students or that group of students before they got to the suspect classroom or school, and after they left the school, if they're taking, you know, the same assessment test. You're going to want to look at what their conduct was on the exams that are not in question. What were their erasures like before they got there and after they got there, and what were their scores like before they got there and after they got there. And that's really going to help you refine your questions and identify the right students to be talking to, at least in a K-12, assessment type setting.
Great.
Any other questions?
We've got time for one more question, so I want to ask this as kind of a sideways question here. So, do you have any advice for exam security when it comes to spy gear? This person's currently looking at a company that does electronic scanning, and are there maybe other options may be able to suggest?
Before I mention the better mousetrap, and this is one of the things that keeps me as a test security director up at night. I've seen microphones in document scanners as big as a pencil eraser and disguised appropriately. I've seen ties that have cameras in them. It's one of those things where whoever's administering your exams should be looking for these things, even if it's behavioral analysis. So, you could take the example of one of the test vendors. They use magnetometers because all of these things would obviously need some type of battery or wiring to work. The problem is, are they operating the magnetometers appropriately? And we've seen that fail a few times. Another way we've seen it is we just scanned a video for another client. They suspected that that person was doing some type of item harvesting through device. But are they looking at the screen or the document in a way that is consistent to a pattern so that they can get each page or each screen? If their pattern while you're watching the video isn't consistent, then they most likely aren't. So it's important either while you're admitting people or in your evidence review to look out for these behaviors. If you're worried that someone goes in there and doesn't flag for whatever reason, there's no report, then you need to be looking at specific behaviors during the exam, like how fast they went through it. If they failed spectacularly, that's a great example of that. Because as you've seen with these gunmen or proxy testers in overseas, when they fail terribly, they're really doing it so they can get in front of your test. And the same thing goes with multiple failures. So if someone repeat fails over and over again, why are they consistently going in front of that test? And that's why, at least in my organization, we've instituted a 3 strikes you're out policy. You failed 3 strikes, you have to sit it out until we have a new form. And that's just the way it is, because we're trying to limit item harvesting. I hope that, we could spend all week on that one, but I hope that gave you some ideas.
So I'm going to go ahead. We will be closing up the webinar now. I want to thank everyone for their attendance today. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, this is being recorded, and we will be sending out the slides as well as the recording, link to the recording. And there were a few questions that did not get answered, so we will make sure to answer those in the follow-up email that we send out to everyone. I want to thank Ben and Marc for their time again, and again, thank you for attending.
Thank you.